So here we go. While post-9/11 necessitated Western government responses to counter international and domestic terrorism, this tragic event has been widely exploited by far-right neocons, hardline Christian Zionist right, and xenophobic forces. Islam and mainstream Muslims have been brushstroked with terrorism, equated with the actions of a fraction of violent extremists. At the same time, major polls by Gallup, Pew, and others reported the extent to which many Americans and Europeans had and have a problem not only with terrorists, but also with Islam and Muslims. When we look at the impact of 9/11 on the American Muslim community, and part of this will be the bad news, but there's also good news. So this won't be totally depressing. I should point that out. Despite appeals by President George W. Bush and then his successor, Barack Obama, Islam and Muslim Americans have often not been distinguished carefully from a minority of deadly terrorists who were responsible for 9/11 and subsequent attacks. But in fact, at times, and Park 51 showed it, and the reactions after Park 51 when people referred to mosques as monuments to terrorism, in fact, there's been a sense in America at times that somehow Muslims bear a collective guilt for what some Muslim terrorists have done. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, some 5,000 Arabs and Muslims were rounded up. 80,000 were brought in by the FBI for screening and registration. When Gallup did a poll and asked, what do you admire about Islam and Muslims, 57% of Americans said nothing or I don't know. Significant numbers of Americans then and now, and it's also similar in Europe on this question the loyalty of Muslims and advocate special monitoring of Muslims and mosques. The growth of anti-Muslim bigotry, discrimination, hate speech and violence, attacks against Muslims, mosques, and even Sikhs. A number of Sikhs have been killed because they were mistaken for Muslims, or what we call Islamophobia, has grown significantly. And again, I think Park 51 made many aware of what is the tip of the iceberg of something that's out there, and polls that were then subsequently also done by the Washington Post and the New York Times and others had shocking statistics as to where many Americans were coming from. This was also mirrored and promoted in far-right and Islamophobic popular culture outlets. And this is what then impacts on large numbers of Americans who don't have a context or a background. Media such as Fox Television, Washington Times, New York Post, pundits like Sean Hannity, O'Reilly Show, Glenn Beck, Daniel Pipes, Michael Savage, Ann Coulter, Bridget Gabriel, David Horowitz, and a legion. Organizations and activists and speakers such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Robert Spencer, Frank Gaffney, and internet sites with titles like Jihad Watch, Islamist Watch, and then more subtle titles like American Thinker. You won't find much thinking going on there. Family Security, one of my favorites, Pajama Media, Front Page, and The Right Side also promote these kinds of articles and websites. Militant Christian Zionist preachers, and notice I do this very carefully. I'm not talking about what I would regard as mainstream evangelical and Baptist, but I am talking about militant Christian Zionist preachers, Pat Robertson, John Hagee, Rod Parsley, Franklin Graham, all weighed in. And for many of these folks, to quote Franklin Graham, but you'll also find this in Parsley and Hagee's preaching and in their books and their TV shows, Islam is the problem. Islam is evil. Not simply terrorists are evil. A new study by the Center for American Progress called Fear, Inc., The Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America reports 7 foundations that have provided $42 million, whether knowingly or not, $42 million in support over the past 10 years to these folks and these websites. We know the influence that they can have when we consider and look at the massacre in Norway, and the assassin's 1,500-page manifesto, which demonstrates the influence of this hate speech, because he cites many of these folks and their websites approvingly, having read their materials. I am delighted to tell you that the Center and myself personally are on page 61, and fortunately we're seen as on the other side. But how one interprets that becomes a question. The impact of this milieu can be seen in America's 2008 presidential elections, the positions taken by many of, in particular, the Republican candidates, not just with regard to the issue of terrorism, but how to respond to it vis-a-vis American Muslims. The 2010 congressional elections, and one can think of statements by Newt Gingrich comparing the supporters of Park 51 to Nazis who would want to demonstrate outside the Holocaust Museum. The frenzy over anti-Sharia development of campaigns in some 20 states. Many of these, again, feed off statements of mainstream politicians, and that's important. In Europe, they develop anti-immigrant parties. Here, it's many of our mainstream politicians. Here, I mean people who belong to our mainstream political parties, members of Congress, governors who are running for office, and presidential candidates. One can look at Botman and statements, Kane's statements, although I understand he now has had a change of heart, Polenti, and a number of others. It's time for a new narrative, or if you will, a counter-narrative. This one informed by facts, not fiction. A narrative informed by, that is data-driven, to replace the shrill voices of militant Muslim bashers and opportunistic politicians chasing funding, votes, and media. And here I would cite, for example, Representative Peter King and his hearings. Major polls by Gallup and Pew have demonstrated that despite American Muslim concerns, fears, and the significant impact in a post-9/11 world that has occurred to their civil liberties and the demonization of Islam, the good news is American Muslims are economically, educationally, and increasingly politically integrated. Even more so, far from the image of a fifth column of foreign terrorist sympathizers and Sharia-imposing boogeymen, data indicates that Muslim Americans are actually among the most integrated, optimistic, thriving, and loyal citizens in the country. Not surprisingly, 60% of Muslim Americans believe that most Americans are prejudiced towards Muslims, or have become, and data shows that roughly half of Americans take that position, comparing their attitude of prejudice towards Muslims vis-a-vis other religious groups. 48% of Muslims, by far the highest of any other group, say they have personally experienced religious or racial discrimination in the past year. They are, as a group, critical of counterterrorism measures imposed since the terror attacks, that is the way they are imposed, and a large percentage distrust the FBI. Just 60% of Muslim Americans said they have confidence in the FBI, compared to 75% of Americans from other religious groups. While 81% believe it is not possible to profile a terrorist based on demographic traits, that is 81% of Muslims, 49% of American groups believe that it is possible to do that profiling. But at the same time, again, Muslim Americans remain optimistic about their own status and future in America. The way I like to put it is, they more than most Americans believe in the American dream, the way many of us in our younger years did, and still believe in it. And there are stats on it. Muslim Americans report being better off or more optimistic in 2011 than in 2008. This data comes from Gallup, and you can look it up right on their website. Their life evaluation ratings have increased more than any other American religious group. 60% report thriving in 2011, up 19 percentage points from 2008. They are also more hopeful about their future than any other major religious group. In contrast to their critics who question their loyalty, Muslim Americans, 78%, are most likely to reject violently military attacks on civilians, and most likely, 89%, to reject violent individual attacks on civilians versus other major U.S. religious groups who are more prone to accept those kinds of attacks. 93% said they believe other Muslim Americans are loyal to their country. In contrast, 10 years after 9/11, significant minorities and other religious groups doubt the loyalty of Muslim Americans. 37% of American Protestants, 35% of Catholics. Muslim Americans, I'll get by this, they tend to vote Democrat. They've seen the light, but I don't want to go there right now, betraying my politics. They are happier with the political climate since the election of Obama. 57% have full confidence in the honesty of our elections, the highest of all major U.S. religious groups. They are among the most open group to other faith communities, with 44% classified as integrated, 48% as tolerant, and only 8% as isolated. In conclusion, the 10th anniversary memorial commemoration of September 11th provides an opportunity to remember the past, but also a time to recognize the critical need for a data-driven and informed new narrative or counter-narrative. Truth is sometimes stranger than fiction. The fiction constructed by the bigotry, racism, and fear-mongering that has infected our popular culture and society. Now is the time to reassess and rebuild our national unity on facts, not fiction. Thank you.